Hello and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of YouGov, I would like to thank you all for attending. My name is Holly Fong. I'm the Regional Marketing Director for APAC and MENA, and I will be moderating the audience Q&A at the end of the webinar. We are here today to discuss consumer behavior shifts and the driving consumer decisions on mobility and transportation. Before we go any further, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions at any point in the presentations, please write and submit them via the chat functions. We have dedicated time at the end of the sections to come back to these, and we will try and get through as many as possible. We are also going to be recording this webinar, so we can share with a wider audience afterwards. Copy of these slides will also be available afterwards. Right, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker for this webinar. The speaker joining me for this webinar is Susanna Mitrovic, Global Sector Head of Automotive at YouGov. Susanna, I will now pass over to you to present today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to present our data and insights to the audience in APAC region and beyond. I want to extend my very warm welcome to all of you joining us today for this hopefully insightful session on mobility and transportation. So let me briefly introduce myself. As Holly mentioned, my name is Susanna Mitrovic and I'm a Global Sector Head of Automotive at YouGov. I'm based here in London, UK. I have many years of experience working with the automotive and mobility sector in driving change with data insights and analytics across the globe. I'm also closely following the emerging trends, OEMs and emerging companies as they go through the transformation, the digital transformation and the mobility transportation transformation in the sector that is taking place in this space at the moment. I'm very fortunate to be able to use YouGov data for understanding the latest trends in mobility, transportation, car ownership, attitudes, and consumer behavioral changes across the globe. So let me just briefly introduce who we are as a business. YouGov is the #1 most quoted source of research in the world. We are widely cited in press from the work we do with brands in politics, but also as a result of companies using our research to support their brand communication and public relations activities. We're leaders in innovation for research data and analytics, and our company is supported by over 17 million panelists globally who take our surveys every day. We are in over 70 countries and growing, and we hold over 1 million data points on our panelists, so we know a lot about that. All of our data is stored in a connected database, which we call the Cube, which was the base for this presentation. The beauty of the Cube is that all of the data is stored over time and it is connected, so we can understand how people felt about automotive brands and mobility yesterday, but also how they felt about it 3 or 5 years ago. So moving on, just a brief slide to show a connected solution of data products and how it all works across the different products, syndicated products that we have, such as YouGov Profiles and YouGov Brand Index. And just one more slide to show the global coverage. This map shows our presence across the world. We have offices in 35 offices in 22 countries. As you can see, have a number of offices located across Asia, including India, Singapore, and Australia. So let's move on to what we will discuss today. We will cover the subject of consumer personal vehicle usage. We will look in some detail at the profile of the car buyers in Australia, and then we'll finish off by discussing the other forms of mobility and transportation, such as ride-hailing and car-sharing services. And to go into a little more detail about today's presentation and what we're using, We conducted the research between March and April this year, and it was actually across a wider geographic footprint of 17 markets. You can see there that we spoke to 19,000 respondents to gather the data. And some of this data was published in our International Automotive Report earlier this year. So let's move on to discussing the personal vehicle usage. I think I would expect all of you on the call today understand and are aware that automotive and mobility sector is going through transformation and changes at a fast pace. And I would also say at many different levels. Insights like the ones we're sharing today will support and guide the understanding of what consumers expect, what information and education they might need as the transformation happens. There is no doubt that driving habits have also changed recently, in some instances dramatically over the course of the last 2 years. The need for transportation has, in some cases, been reduced, and in some cases, it has changed to a need for personal safe space. So consumers moving from public transportation to the personal safe space of a car from a health and safety perspective. The changes mobility and transportation needs and consumer behaviors vary from urban to rural areas, from country to country, as well as across different socio-demographic groups. And now let's look at some numbers. Globally, 59% expect a change in their own need for a personal vehicle, so a car. We are seeing that younger age cohort intends to use the personal vehicles more, which means that their need for transportation has not disappeared or been reduced, but the desire for personal safe space has increased the need for a car. The old age group, over 55 plus, is showing an opposite intention, and this has been driven in many cases by a period of shielding and protection of older cohort as a result of the pandemic. Thus, the older ones have less need for transportation and mobility. And I would like to draw your attention to the last number on this slide, which is an important one. Taking into account all of the transportation modes, cars, car sharing, ride hailing, the personal vehicle or car is the highest mode of transportation when modes are chosen. It's coming at 83%. This has significant implications for the transportation and mobility management. It has many implications for congestion and environment, and those are significant. And this, I would argue, requires development of more comprehensive transportation and mobility solutions, which are clearly needed. Let's look at some more numbers here. Behavioral changes have affected people across the globe and how often and when they drive their own vehicles, as well as their intentions for the future. Society will no doubt change in respect to how often we move. People working from home and reduced social interactions have impacted the need to move and the amount of time spent in the vehicle. There are many reasons for the changes, such as postponed plans, revised budgets, or reduced budgets as a result of job loss, different model preferences related to EVs and hybrids. And all of these are obvious given the measures that have been and are still placed in regards to pandemic in many countries. As far as intent to drive a car is concerned, we are obviously looking to understand the future trends. So if you look at the data on this chart, globally in most markets, the car usage will remain the same for about 30 to 50% of the drivers across Asian markets. To the left, the four markets defined as high personal vehicle markets, Australia, China, India, and Indonesia, you can see a significant increase of intended use of personal vehicle of approximately 30% which you can see for China, India, Indonesia. To the right, you can see that Hong Kong and Singapore are showing an increase of 11% for the cars. As I mentioned, looking at the global statistics in relation to different modes of transport, here's the breakdown by age. As you can see from these stats, there is a trend towards more car usage as you go through the age groups from older ones to younger ones. Sorry, just got stuck there. And to summarize this section, data shows that globally and in APAC region, consumer behavior is changing and the needs and expectations are changing. I'm now going to show you Australian consumer profile in more details. So who are the Australians planning to drive more? Our profiles data suggests that the group includes younger cohort, 25 to 34-year-olds, and they're more likely to be parents than an attract and more likely to be in a full-time job. Looking at the purchase method amongst Australians planning to buy a car, it should be noted that there is an increase in online buying. This trend will gain more velocity as consumers become more comfortable making big purchases online and as platforms for online car retail become more sophisticated and flexible, catering for a wide range of needs of potential car buyers. As for the factors and car features that Australian drivers consider for the new car, I have outlined the top 5 from our global automotive profiles. Price comes as a top one in every market globally. Cruise control as a top feature is not the one that is seen elsewhere as a top one. This, I assume, is due to the vastness of the country and the cruise control being a car feature that is used a lot more in Australia than in very urban areas of big cities like Mumbai or Tokyo. As a result of changes coming out of the pandemic, the consumers in Australia who intend to drive more are also bringing forward their plans to buy a new car. This is good news, of course, for the automotive industry and dealer network. And this is something that we have seen happening in other markets as well across the globe. And to summarize, there is plenty of opportunity to sell more cars and cater for the increased personal vehicle usage in Australia and elsewhere. Of course, this has to be aligned with the consumer expectations about the type of the vehicle they would like to have, such as hybrid or EV, which is gaining more traction, and the type of car features that they wish to have, as well as introducing the options of online retail and giving that to consumers as a way of buying a vehicle. So let's now look at the data for other forms of mobility and transportation. Looking at the global statistics in relation to different modes of transport and the expected usage of those, the only mode of transport without a negative trend is the one of personal vehicle. Public transportation usage is estimated to be 23% less globally. We are seeing this in real life, manifested by bigger traffic jams in cities now in comparison to pre-pandemic times of 2019. This is an area that has to be a concern and has to influence the sustainability of the mobility and transportation solutions beyond individual car ownership and usage. So just seeing there are a few questions coming up in the chat, but Holly will post them at the end, so we will address them. Okay. Let's look at data in more detail. At the top of the bars in grey, you can see the percentage of population that will reduce public transportation usage. Most of the countries are showing the 20% or above reduction, with 49% in India intending to move away from public transport. This is a huge shift and massive issue for many reasons. Just imagine congestion environmental impact, parking issues in urban areas. Those percentages are staggering. Ride-hailing apps were hard hit during the pandemic as use cases such as social events and other activities dried up due to restrictions. When asked about plans to use this form of transportation in the next 12 months, the more to less ratio was negative in all markets observed across APAC region. Much work will need to be done to restore confidence in ride-hailing as a safe and viable transportation mode. As time progresses, this will be a crucial indicator to observe as it could change quite rapidly. Car sharing services are among the latest innovations in the space of personal vehicle options. The industry is still immature, with China being the only market with a high adoption rate and strong intention for the future. India, the second most penetrated market for this type of service, has one of the biggest less to more intention ratios among any markets. New user acquisition will be crucial to continue the growth of this industry. In Australia, the overall awareness of the car subscription service is at 37% overall. But as you can see on this slide, the data shows significant differences about the future use of these services by age group. The drop in the interest for these services from the age of 45 plus is huge. The providers of the mobility subscription services must cater to the young age cohorts and their needs. However, longer term, there is a big job to capture the interest of 45 plus. To summarize this section, here's the outline of the main data insights. Behavioral shifts in mobility and transportation have been accelerated with the pandemic. The transition from individual car ownership to mobility as a service has been negatively impacted by the pandemic. The intent to drive a personal car rather than using a car as a service is an unforeseen behavioral change. The mobility services companies experienced a major global disruption. The key to the success of companies in this area will be in the fast and flexible adoption of the business models to meet the changed mobility and transportation behaviors and attitudes of the consumer globally. So there is a need to assure the consumers of the safety from a health perspective of a shared car. Of course, the need for mobility and transportation will continue. However, the shift from a transportation focused on vehicle ownership and capacity to a service-based model focused on this usage is at the moment modestly happening, but this could change if the consumers gain confidence. The mobility and transportation future lies with the personalized customer offering, I would argue, and it has to be tailored to individual needs. This is being enabled with the digitalization and connectivity of the vehicles. Car owners and car users must feel safe and have the options for flexible, sustainable, and personal car ownership or car usage offerings. The broader mobility and transportation models have to be inclusive. By this, I mean they have to cater for all age groups in order to be successful. And this now brings us to the end of the actual presentation. I'm going to pass it back to Holly for Q&A.
Thank you, Susanna, for a very insightful presentations. It's now time for our audience Q&A. Thank you to those who have submitted their questions. Please remember, if you have a questions, it's not too late to submit them via the chat function. Our first question is coming from Meg, who has asked, for the high personal vehicle markets, Australia is the odd ones out as China, India, Indonesia share many commonalities. Are there any examples a bit more similar to Australia? For example, the financial affluence, population density, etc.
Sorry, Holly, I didn't capture the question. Can you just repeat that for me?
Matt has asked that for the high personal vehicle markets, Australia is the odd one because other markets like China, India, Indonesia has shared a lot of common area. So are there any examples more about like why Australia is so outstanding and different from the others? Is there any other examples?
We have other examples elsewhere in the world. This study from APAC perspective, and I know you've listed the countries there, they're showing different trends to Australia, but we certainly have countries in Europe that have similar trends to Australia. I would say that the trends that we are seeing globally, if we look at the picture, are very similar if you compare countries with similar geographies or similar population density or similar income. The trends are on par, I would say, but you do see the shift from public transportation, especially in very big cities. So if you think about Mumbai or Mexico City, there is quite I would say quite a lot of concern about using public transportation. And you don't see that in the countries like Australia, where public transportation might not be as prevalent as a form of mobility.
Thanks, Susanna. We have another question. Do you think that the trends in our International Automotive Reports 2021 will change as we emerge from the pandemic?
They will continue to happen. Will they change? Yes, I think that they will change, but not go back to what it was before. I think, and there are many reasons for this. This presentation today is focused on behavioral change of the consumers. But there's multiple levels of transformation happening in the automotive and mobility industry. And there is the level of transformation because of connectivity of the vehicles, and level of transportation because of digital space. And those changes are in motion. Some of them have been speeded up by pandemic, but certainly they will continue. Will we see some consumer behavioral change disappear? Yes, some of it, I think, consumers will gain confidence and will embrace more public transportation where they have gone away. But it will take time. And when I say take time, it might, we still have pandemic, so in many parts of the world. So this time slot could be number of years. It's not going to be a fast change.
I see. Thanks, Susanna. We have another question asking, are people willing to share their location data, and do you feel that driver will be willing to accept promotions or ads in their vehicles?
I get asked that question fairly regularly because as the new connected car becomes more of a norm, manufacturers and OEMs are looking for new revenue streams. My view is that if the consumer sees a benefit in having information in the car, they would be willing to accept it. But it's the same concept whether you as a consumer see a benefit in, for example, having YouTube for free, but accepting that you will have to see some of the ads. If you are willing to pay for a particular subscription, then you as a consumer might very likely assume that you won't be seeing those ads. So it's one of those, yes, I think they're willing to share, but there has to be a benefit to the consumer.
Fair enough. And we have another question coming from Sri, asking, looking at the online Australia consumer buyer profiles, what would you say is the key data point that we should take away from this webinar?
Well, if you recall, when I mentioned who is the main buyer in Australia, it's a younger age cohort with families, so kids, and I think that manufacturers, OEMs, and online retail has to cater for them first and foremost, because that is a group that intends to buy a car in the next 12 months that might not have wanted to buy a car before, but because of the change in the transportation and mobility behavior, they have pulled forward their plans. So that's a very clear target audience for the Australian market.
Thank you. We have another question asking, how do you see sustainability being managed by YouGov's data?
Sustainability has many aspects to it, and sustainability in automotive and mobility has a very obvious area, which is adoption of electric vehicles and hybrids, where the shift from obviously fossil fuel engines to more eco-friendly engines has an element of improving the environment through lack of emissions. So we're doing quite a lot of work to understand the adoption and barriers around EVs and hybrids. So that's an immediate focus for us, and we are trending and looking at how to monitor trends on a daily basis, basically, for these types of engines.
Thank you. Another question asks, given that global populations are rapidly aging, are transport professionals giving sufficient considerations to how their mobility needs can be met?
That is a very pertinent question, especially for the cities, and something that is being discussed quite a lot in various forums and conferences that I've attended recently. And the short answer is that the old age cohort is not looked after very well if you think about transportation and mobility schemes and programs, where there is an encouragement to reduce the car usage but increase some form of public transportation or shared car ownership, but also use the alternative methods such as scooters or some of the other more modes of transport that are not cars. And the fact is that all the people are not necessarily feeling comfortable using those transportation models, and that's why I think we see all the people being far more inclined to use a personal car. And because all of this is very much in its infancy, and I think pretty much every city around the world has its own way of trying to come with the new models and tweaking them as they go into place. It will take some time before all of the age groups are very looked after. So I certainly think that there is there's very few examples of good practices at the moment for the older age cohort.
Thank you. Mohammed has also submitted questions. He asked, how will the effects of the new paradigms, such as mobility subscriptions, impact consumers' behavior and the shopping preference in mobility?
As consumers globally are more akin to e-commerce, online retail, I think there will be more and more expectation to do at least some parts of the car buying online, if not all of it. And certainly I have discussed that in the automotive report that we published earlier this year. And I think that consumers globally are getting more comfortable paying for the big car purchase online. So they still want to do the test drive, but that can be arranged in many other ways, not necessarily going to a dealership to do it.
Thank you. And Carrie has asked a question as well. Why is it in countries such as Indonesia, India, China, and UAE, they all intend to use personal vehicle more versus less?
I think it's that desire to have the safe personal space. So car is perceived as somewhere where you as an individual have a control of, very simply put it, of cleanliness of that space. If you are in a public transportation or car sharing mode of transport, you as an individual don't have that control. So you don't know who has used it before, whether it has been cleaned, you know, which areas in there, has it been ventilated? And I think that's that unforeseen, if you want, unforeseen consequence of the pandemic.
Thank you, Susanna. I think that's it for the questions that we have received from the chat. So thanks everybody for joining. As mentioned, we will be sharing the recording and the slides in a follow-up email. But if you have any questions in the meantime, do not hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to connecting with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.